Either you have the right to reauthorize existing sanctions, or you don't. And from my perspective of and the language, yes, it is a letter and it's not the agreement, but what I was reading the day that we had the hearing was the agreement. I didn't even know about this letter then. So I look at the agreement, and the wording of the agreement is what flagged for me the concern that led to that line of questioning. And it was pretty clear to me that he never said, yes, at some point we need to reauthorize this. When I said, suggesting that he lapse, that he could have said, no, that's not. I'm not agreeing that we should let it lapse. So I take the composite of that testimony and the joint comprehensive plan of actions language, and now I further buttress it with the letter of the Iranian intent, and it says to me, we've got a problem as it relates to continuing existing sanctions. Now, those sanctions could be suspended by the administration. I'm not talking about altering the nature of the existing sanction regime we have. I'm talking about just taking it and reauthorizing it. Some people would want to actually diminish the president's waivers authorities. I'm not even talking about that. I'm just simply saying taking what it is. And I read both the agreement and the statements of the secretary to say they don't support that. That's a problem, because you have to snap back to something. The other thing I'm concerned about, I look at what this committee did when we authorized the use of force for the issue of Syria as it relates to its chemical weapons. And we heralded and heard the administration. As a matter of fact, in March, Secretary Kerry said, we cut a deal and we were able to get all the chemical weapons out of Syria in the middle of the conflict. Well, I'm concerned about that 1 year after that celebration of removing Syria's arsenal, that U.S. intelligence agencies have concluded that the regime didn't give up all the chemical weapons it was supposed to, and that the whole process by which inspectors were allowed to pursue, again, is going to be a narrative of what we're going to have as it relates to our ability to have inspectors pursue Iran in this case. Inspectors, Syria specified what access to its that it would give access to its declared weapon sites, much as Iran is expected to give UN inspectors on federal access to its own declared sites. But for any undeclared sites, inspectors could request access provided they furnish information of their suspicions, giving the regime plenty of time to move, deceive, and hide. And you listen to one of the inspectors in Syria, and they said they couldn't afford to antagonize their hosts in order to not lose access to all the sites. So this is a recent pastor's prologue. And so it concerns me about our enforcement mechanism moving forward. And then finally, what I do want to pick your brains on, and you've both been very in depth in your thoughts, and I appreciate it. But let me ask you this. Let's assume, for argument's sake, that the deal had not been consummated. Would we be going to war right now?
Well, I think the answer to that is you should ask the administration, if you can, to provide to you in disclosure what their contingency plan was when they went into the negotiations, what alternatives they were considering, and how they had fully developed those alternatives. Because to go into negotiation without fully developing your alternatives would be a mistake. I think we would all agree, and I'm sure the administration has done a lot of work and has fully developed alternatives, Senator Menendez, apart from war. And so if they hadn't developed alternatives, I think we should be disturbed. If they had developed alternatives, we should find out if those alternatives only included war. And if they didn't only include war, then the administration, in claiming now that there's no alternative to this deal but war, is actually contradicting the very contingency plans that they built into the negotiation.
Ambassador Burns, will we be going to war?
I don't think that war is an inevitable consequence of the deal falling apart. I know some people have made the argument, if the deal falls apart, or if Congress disapproves, we're going to get war. I don't follow that logic. It all depends on what the Iranians decide to do. I think they're smarter than to try to provoke a military attack by the US or Israel. So I would think if the deal fell apart, if Congress disapproved, if a veto was overridden, I would think we'd probably end up with an Iran as a nuclear threshold state. They would go ahead on their uranium and plutonium, but I'm not sure they'd cross the line towards a nuclear weapon and therefore almost assuredly invite a response by either Israel or the United States. And very quickly, Senator, I think you're right to focus on the IAEA. In a way, the real enforcement arm is the United States. Mm-hmm. If there's a clear violation, if there's a covert facility detected by the IAEA, the only country that can do anything about it is the U.S. and maybe a few of our allies.
And I'm concerned about that because another independent witness, David Albright, has been before the committee several times, and I think the chairman has invited him back, has said at different times, every time that Iran has had a violation, we seem to find a way to excuse it. And Iran has a history here of deceit, deception, delay, that has brought us to this point that we are now accepting things, those who who believe the agreement is the right agreement, that we are now accepting things we would have never envisioned accepting. And so the one thing I took away, among other things, from you, Ambassador Burns, is that having a very strong response to violations is going to be critically important, but so far our precedent here on that has not been particularly strong. You know, if you can argue a case both ways, it's fantastic if you can get away with it. But it's either one or the other. Now, you know, the secretary was here and he said Iran has, the Ayatollah has issued a fatwa, which is basically a religious decree that, in fact, you know, there can be no nuclear arms because that's a violation of their religious beliefs. Iran has consistently argued that they have been and are only interested in a peaceful civilian nuclear program. So if that's the case, then, and the secretary is advocating as part of his overall argument about the fatwa and mentions it as part of the element, well, then why would we presume that Iran is going to rush to a nuclear weapon immediately if there isn't a fulfillment of the agreement as envisioned? So I think that's you know, I don't buy, and I appreciate the honest answers from both of you, is that it isn't war necessarily automatically. Because that is the proposition that is being painted. And finally, I would say, you know, this basically, we think about the out years. The reality is in about a year, Iran's going to get most of its sanctions relief, assuming they comply with the initial implementation. And so in year 2, 3, or 4, you know, forget about 8 or 10 or 15, the regime determines that whatever is happening in the Gulf region, that they, in fact, that preservation of the revolution and the regime is best ensured by having a nuclear weapon. So let's say they decide to break the agreement and move forward, just for argument's sake. At that point, though, what we will be facing is the same choices that we allegedly have today. And the reality is, however, I don't think it's quite the same choice, Mr. Chairman, because you will have an Iran that is economically resurgent, an Iran that will have taken care of some of its domestic, not all, but some of its domestic challenges, an Iran that will have $100 and $150 billion, and let's assume that it isn't all, it's not going to be all spent on terrorism, but take 5% of it. If Iran that is reeling from economic sanctions today and falling oil prices is willing to engage in the Houthis in Yemen, in Hezbollah in Lebanon, in propping up Assad in Syria and creating mischief in Iraq, far different than our national interests in Iraq, with the sources they have now, when they're flush with money, when we talk about war, I'm really concerned about a regional conflict that emanates from that. So it's in this balance of things that I think, you know, some of these, what I don't care for is the proposition that it's either this or war, because you can't argue it both ways. And I appreciate the opportunity to explore that with the witnesses.
Senator Menendez, can I just ask just one point? I actually do think there will become a point in time where it'll be, our only option will be military force. I mean, I'm going to be as bold as to suggest that, and you know, this is, again, we're scenario planning, and I've tried to the best of my ability in my written testimony, which is excessively long, and I apologize for that, but in the 43 pages, I've tried to work through these scenarios to try and understand this, and it would be useful to work through these scenarios, I think, with others. But my worst case scenario is that, as you've described, a much stronger Iran, a much more economically resilient Iran with conventional and regional power, and an Iran with an industrial-sized nuclear program, a near-zero breakout with an easier clandestine sneak-out, where breakout time is now a matter of days, I have a very hard time figuring out how do you use economic sanctions to stop that Iran. And if you don't have economic sanctions to stop that Iran, then you really only have military force, or you concede. And so my concern with this deal is that the very structure of the deal, the way it's architected, positions Iran at that point where we will actually have to use military force against an Iran that will be much stronger, and the consequences will be much more severe. And that is why, again, just pointing out, to maybe for the fifth time, and I apologize, for me that this isn't about walking away from the deal, this isn't about blowing up a deal, this isn't about going back to no enrichment. This is about some simple amendments to the deal. I say simple, I understand how complicated they will be to negotiate. But one of the fundamental amendments is on the sunset provision. I give Ambassador Burns a lot of credit. I helped negotiate UN Security Council Resolution 1737, which was the policy of the US government. And in that resolution, it specifically prohibits a sunset provision. And it's a very interesting language. We at that point, under the Bush administration, made it very explicit that there would not be an artificial time-delineated sunset. And so, yes, this is complicated, it's messy, but we should insist on that one amendment, the way Henry Jackson in the 1970s insisted on amendments, the way that we've insisted on, US Congress has insisted on amendments for its history. I think that would make a fundamental difference, and if it did, we may not be in the position where we're going to have to use military force against a hardened target and a massive nuclear program.